It is really important that we actually get clear on what trauma is and what trauma isn't. Assalamu alaikum. If you're new here, my name is Hannah. I am a trauma coach for Muslim women, and this is a topic I'm obviously extremely passionate about. So let's talk about it. So often you hear people use trauma very loosely. I've been traumatized. Oh, that was traumatizing. Oh, that was traumatic. But the reality of it is trauma is actually not just a feeling we have about something that happened, but it is actually an experience that literally changes the brain. And when we understand how and why that happens, we can get clear on the actual problem. And when we can get clear on the actual problem, then we can reverse engineer the problem to solve it. So let me give you a story. We have Aisha and Fatima. Aisha and Fatima are walking in a park together on a bright Sunday afternoon. And unexpectedly, a stray dog appears in the distance. Now, Aisha and Fatima both notice this stray dog, and all of a sudden, this dog starts charging at them. Aisha and Fatima book it and run the other direction, and alhamdulillah, they end up outrunning the stray dog. They end up behind a fence. The dog can't reach them. Now, a month later, Aisha looks back at the experience and she laughs and she says, "Oh my God, Fatima, do you remember that time we got chased by a stray dog?" And she's able to tell it like the story that it was and move on. Whereas Fatima now has developed a phobia of dogs. She never used to be afraid of dogs, but after that experience, she finds herself getting sweaty and nervous, and her heart starts racing anytime she sees a dog, even if it's a dog on a leash. What happened there? The same experience, the same circumstances, and yet two very different outcomes. This is the example of trauma. Now, while that experience might have been a traumatic experience, Aisha did not end up traumatized, but Fatima did. And the answer is very simple. Aisha somehow, someway managed to build up her nervous system to a level of resiliency where when that experience happened, her nervous system was able to kick into high gear to get her out of the situation, but then recognize that this thing that happened, it's no longer happening, and it can move that experience from short-term memory to long-term memory. And then her body was able to integrate the experience so that she's not physically feeling the symptoms or what was happening to her during that actual time. Whereas Fatima, on the other hand, her nervous system felt so overwhelmed by the experience that had happened that it kicked into high gear, but it never learned how to turn off. And that is the key point. Trauma is essentially when our nervous system is not able to turn off its fight or flight response when something traumatic happens. And because of that, our brain and body starts to treat day to day as if the traumatic experience is still happening. Now, this doesn't necessarily look like you having flashbacks, although this is sometimes an experience people have, but it looks like physiologically experiencing the same exact signs and symptoms that you experienced during that time. In the case of Fatima, anytime she runs across or sees a dog or hears a dog or thinks about a dog, she might start to experience that sense of panic, or heart starts racing, her hands start sweating. Now, between these two, does that mean that Fatima was weaker? Does that mean that she was morally incompetent? Does that mean she has less trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? No. It just means that a combination of genetic influences and environmental influences in Fatima's life led her nervous system to a place where something like that is so overwhelming, and her nervous system did not yet have the tools or resources to adjust. Why is this important to understand? The nervous system is an extremely robust system. And if you don't know what the nervous system is, it is essentially a connection of our brain, spinal cord, all the nerves that come out of it. It collects information, it sends signals to different body parts, organs, muscles, and so on. It is the way we interact with the world. It's the reason why you're able to understand what I'm saying to you right now. It's the reason why I'm able to even communicate to you in the first place. It's what allows us to have emotions and feelings, to understand things. It's an incredible blessing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us. But when it comes to the topic around trauma, we are very, very limited in our understanding. And it's just now in the recent decades that we are starting to come to an understanding of how trauma affects the nervous system. Trauma is such a horrendous experience for people to handle that our neglect of understanding what trauma is leads people to a point where they feel stuck. They feel disconnected. They find that certain things that used to be easy for them are no longer easier for them. It really impacts their day-to-day living. And as Muslims, we have an added layer to this because we don't just live our life day to day. We also worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one thing I say as a trauma coach, and this is something that I found time and time again when it comes to working with my clients, is that trauma also affects our relationship with Allah subhanahu subhanahu wa ta'ala. For better or for worse, we may find ourselves coming closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in an attempt to cope with the trauma, or we may find ourselves distancing ourselves from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a result of what we've experienced. Either way, there's a consequence there. So if as Muslims we're not understanding that trauma exists and it's a real problem, then what we end up doing is really stifling our progress in our own lives, in the world, and the way we can show up for our families, for our friends, for our communities, and ultimately the ummah. The really powerful thing about understanding trauma at a neuroscience level is it reminds us that biologically, trauma makes sense. It makes sense as to why something like that would happen and change the way Fatima reacts to dogs but not to Aisha. It makes sense, and it helps us offset blame on individuals or assume that the reason we are so distressed after a traumatic experience is because of our own weakness. That's not true. We are distressed after a traumatic experience because it reverberates throughout our nervous system until we resolve that trauma. And this isn't just my thinking or my theory. We literally have brain scans of people's brains during trauma and what happens. In fact, it is truly incredible that in the state of trauma, when someone is remembering a traumatic memory or they are re-traumatized, as in something brings up the memory on its own, if we put them in a brain scanning machine, we can actually see that the prefrontal cortex of their brain, which is a part that allows them to reason through things, to understand things, to inhibit certain reactions, actually down-regulates. It almost turns off. Whereas the part of the brain that is responsible for memories and emotions and reactions and intensity and anger and all of these really, really important functions upregulates. It turns on. Now, the thing is, when that part of our brain, the emotional part of our brain, is turned on, it's very hard to turn back on the reasoning side of our brain. And so when someone is re-traumatized or having a trauma response, it's very hard for them to reason through that and to quote unquote control themselves. That in effect will influence their relationships with people, the way they feel about themselves, the way they perform at work, at school, the way they show up for their family. And so understanding the system is really important, again, because now that we understand how this actually affects and changes our brain, it makes it easier for us to reason through how can we reverse it? How do we downregulate the emotional side of the brain when we are experiencing trauma or re-experiencing trauma? And how do we upregulate the part of our brain that helps us to think through things and realize that this thing happened in the past, it's no longer happening to us, or even if it's still happening to us, that it's not as dangerous as our brain and body is making it seem to be. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, okay, Hannah, cool. Now that we understand how this actually works at a physiological level, at a neuroscience level, how do we resolve it? Well, stay tuned, inshallah, because I'm going to be making a lot more videos on this topic. But before I end, I would love to say for any Muslim woman who is watching this, I have two things for you to know. First and foremost, I would love to invite you to my new digital community. The link is in the description. In this digital community, I am doing free live coaching for the ladies in it. We are doing resource gathering, lots of information there for you to learn about what trauma is, how trauma affects us, and how to actually heal trauma at a body, mind, and soul level. If you're watching this during the month of June 2024, it is absolutely free for you to enter. You will be able to lock in a lifetime free subscription if you join the community now. If you're watching it after, it is still an incredible value for everything that you get in there to help you on your healing journeys, healing alongside wonderful women. The link is in the description. Now, for my ladies here who are ready to dive into healing, you want the system, you want to work through it, and you want to do it alongside incredible ladies with my help and support, you can go to the link in the description to sign up for my Trauma Groove Coaching Program, which is an exclusive program where I take you through 3 months of really intentional, focused, faith-based, and science-based healing. If you guys like this video, make sure to like and hit subscribe and comment below if you have any questions. I'll see you in the next one. Assalamu alaikum.